Can you see if I can hear it?
All right, so as you all may have known from looking at this is an exceedingly short chapter. So, good thing this would.
Yeah.
So, let's just go ahead and get started with Article 1. In the beginning, God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit was pleased to create or make the world and all things in it, both visible and invisible, in a 6-day period, and all very good. He did this to manifest the glory of his eternal power, wisdom, and goodness. So this article I titled The Act of Creation. And to start off with, we have who was the creator. Well, we have God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. They all cooperated in this act of creation. It wasn't just, God the Father's like, oh, I'm going to go do this, or God the Son who was like, did the same thing. No, it was all three of them cooperated. Yeah. So why did God create? And the first thing we see is that God was pleased. It was God's pleasure to create.
Amen.
To create or make the world and all things in it, both visible and invisible. And then we see he did this to manifest the glory of his eternal power, to manifest the glory of God's eternal wisdom, and manifest the glory of God's eternal goodness. So if we look back just to, chapter 3, this is very similar to what we see with God's decree. God decreed things because it demonstrated his power, it demonstrated his wisdom, it demonstrated God's goodness. And again, like I said last week, everything God does is comes out of who God is, comes out of God's attributes. So chapter 2, that's why the confession does things the way it does. How do we know who God is? Chapter 1, the scriptures. What is God like? Chapter 2, God's attributes. And then now that we have those two foundations, then we can get into other doctrines. So once we know how we find out these things, and once we know what God is like, the rest of these doctrines start making sense. God created because of God's attributes. God used his attributes in creation. So then, what was created? The world and all things in it. And that includes both things visible and things invisible. So visible things that makes sense to us. God created the molecules that make up the table. He created the dirt, the earth, the rocks, the tree, mankind. Things invisible. What is that talking about? That could be the wind. God created the wind. God created the air. God created things that you cannot see. The spirit, angels, your soul, things like this. All these things that we cannot see, molecules, atoms, emotions, things that don't have physical substance. God created both visible and invisible. And all things were very good. All was very good. Now then, how did God create? And it's something that we kind of skipped over as we looked through this. It's the one thing that, as we look at our confession, that I haven't said, and that is a 6-day period. God created in 6 literal days. And what this means is that if we decide to adopt this confession, anybody who wants to join our church will have to hold to a 6 literal day creation. So it means that if they hold to a 1,000-year theory, or one day is as 1,000 years, and they project that onto the meaning of Genesis 1. That would disqualify them from joining us. We're not saying that you're not a Christian, but we are saying that this is what the Bible teaches, and this is what we profess. And if you want to be part of us, this is what you have to profess. Article 2. The creation of man is what I named it. After God had made all the other creatures, he created humanity. He created them male and female with rational and immortal souls, thereby making them suited to that life lived unto God for which they were created. They were made in the image of God, being endowed with knowledge, righteousness, and true holiness. They had the law of God written in their hearts and the power to fulfill it. Even so, they could still transgress the law because they were left to the liberty of their own will, which was subject to change. So yeah, this article, the creation of man. So we see that God created humanity after all the other creatures. So this was his penultimate act of creation. His, I believe the term would be crescendo. I'm not a big musical composer guy, so I might be using that wrongly. This is the grand finale. God's creation of mankind. He created humanity male and female. There's no third option. There's no whatever our culture likes to invent. I failed to think of an example. The Z genders, Zer genders. There's people who try to do animal genders. We're in a messed up time. He created humanity with rational souls, and he created humanity with immortal souls. So what does it mean that we have a rational soul?
You're asking us?
Yeah.
That's feedback here. What's feedback here? Since you talk first, you gotta answer first.
We have a logical brain that God gave us to think about things and process and use logic.
Yes. God gave us the ability to reason.
Yes.
Um,
I think therefore I am.
maybe.
That's a joke. So, and then of course your conscience, whether that's heart, physical, able to speak on that intelligibly, but does that come strictly out of your mind and your brain and your logic from the actual components of your brain? Does your conscience come from your heart? Like your moral fiber that makes you feel, which we believe is the Holy Spirit coming to us and telling us what's right and what's wrong.
Is that a question?
I was kind of trying to answer your question.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the rational souls part is definitely part of that invisible
Yes.
part of the world. If everything is just physicality, rationality, logic, all these things are meaningless. So there's both a physical and unphysical, not physical, immaterial. And rationality doesn't make sense. Emotionality doesn't make sense if all we are is just physical creatures.
Mhm.
And I say that, and animals have an emotional makeup. They don't really have much of a rational one. So with us having rational souls, that means that appeals to reason are something that should make sense to us. As Christians, we don't reject reason. We don't reject rationality. We are created to be rationals because God is rational and we are created in his likeness. Where am I at? Immortal souls. We understand that idea. The soul does not die. Our physical body passes away, but our soul lives forever and goes to Sheol, or goes to heaven or hell. Goes to the grave. So the article continues on. It says, thereby making them suited to that life lived unto God for which they were created. And I titled that basically, able to accomplish their purpose. God created humanity for a reason. He gave them rationality, and he gave their souls immortality for the purpose of accomplishing whatever it was that we were set here for. So part of that is to tend the garden, to keep the earth, tend the earth and keep it. Part of that is also, because we were created in the image of God. We are a mirror image of God. When you look at us, you're supposed to see something of God. Kind of like how we talked about in what was it, chapter 1 or chapter 2, I forget. Where I look at this wall, I can tell you something about who made it. Same thing with us. You look at us as the penultimate act of creation, you're supposed to be able to tell something about the God who created us. And that's a little different now because of the fall. We're now, rather than being a mirror image, we're now more like the Hall of Mirrors from carnivals and stuff like that, with the twisted mirrors make you look really skinny, really short, that kind of thing.
Able to accomplish their
Uh,
purpose.
say it again.
Purpose, thank you.
Able to accomplish their purpose, yes. And the next thing is kind of goes right into that because we've already talked about it. The image of God. We were made in the image of God. Because I'd already used the mirror analogy, I'll just continue on. Made in the image of God. This image means we were endowed with knowledge, we were endowed with righteousness, and we were endowed with true holiness. So Adam in the garden, when he was created, he was not created a fool. He was not created a moron. He was created smart. He had knowledge. One of the ways I like to think about it is he had to name every single animal on the earth. How many of us could do that? That's not a dumb man's task. It's a smart person's task. It also explains humans' tendency to systematize, which means that we group things into categories. That's what Adam did. The very first act Adam did in the garden. He named all the animals, and very shortly he said, "This one looks like that one. Those two go together." I'm going to give them. I'm going to categorize them. That's foundational to humanity. Is systematization, and that's everywhere. Every field of knowledge. Walmart has a specific way of doing things. My company, which deals more engineering-wise, engineering has certain ways of doing things. Tech has a certain way of doing things. They've figured out these approaches. They've said, this is what works best, this doesn't work so well, do this, don't do that. That's systematization. Then God created humanity with the law of God written on their hearts. And he created humanity with the power to fulfill that law of God that was written on their hearts. So what does it mean that the law of God was written on their hearts?
One would be what I was trying to earlier. We got it like not actually what we're us.
Yeah. This idea in theology terms is called natural law, which if you look at your second page, because this one was so short, I decided to give you some helpful definitions. Natural law is the body of unchanging moral principles regarded as a basis for all human conduct. So there are rules
Yes.
that all mankind knows, and most of mankind follows these rules. Some of them will deviate from this in one way or another. All of them deviate from it in some way or another. Our culture realizes murder is wrong, but we deviate from that in that we kill infants in their mother's womb, and we just say, oh, they're not actually people, so it's not murder.
One of the scriptures that comes to mind is the brain falls from the just and just alike.
Yeah. So every culture is built on a similar set of moral principles because it's the law written on our hearts. And each one of them deviates from that in certain ways. Whether some practice human sacrifice.
Seared conscience.
Yes. And so the atheist, one of his arguments is that there is no set of moral principles that's regarded across all of human history. And kind of true because, like I said, each culture will deviate from that law written on their hearts in some way or another. But overall, all of them recognize murder is wrong. All of them recognize theft is wrong. All of them recognize lying is wrong. But each of them will set down different ways that they can get around that. Rationalization. So for us, we kill our infants. For another culture is like, oh, well, murder's wrong, but I'm sacrificing that guy to Baal. I'm sacrificing, I'm superior to them. They're lesser humans than me. And you can know this because I conquered them. So therefore I'm better than them. So I can do whatever I want to do.
Or even truth by numbers.
Yeah.
And we have more people over here to say this than over here. So we're going to come with the fact we have more people over here speaking one thing that makes it truth.
Yeah. And communism is this idea too. Theft is wrong, but those people who have a whole lot, they did it because they were evil, so it's okay if I do a little evil to them. Or
You deserve it.
they deserve it, or well, we voted that we would take their money, so it's not really theft, it's just democracy. It's still theft.
I was thinking about Russia and Iran and some of those countries. They are so against, and rightfully so, with homosexuals, with murdering baby. I mean, they are against that, and they think we are an evil, and we are.
Hmm.
But look what they do.
Sure. Sin is sin. They're just as underneath of every
I
lane.
Yeah.
There was it was a meme I saw that was very good on that. It had a woman in a bikini passing a woman in a burqa,
Uh-huh.
and both of them had a little thought bubble popping off their head. It says, "Look how oppressed they are."
Yeah.
Yeah. So
It's a different version of oppression.
yeah, it is. So this natural law, this unchanging moral principles that are written on our heart, is different from the theological term is positive law. And this is, for instance, God will come to you and say, don't do this, don't do that. So like God did to Moses at Sinai, or God did to Abraham with circumcision. These are not unchanging. We aren't held to circumcision any longer. We aren't under the Mosaic covenant. We don't have to perform the sacrifices of animals. We don't have to have the same type of government they have. We're not under those things. So these are subject to change. Whereas the law that's on our heart, the moral law, is And if you want a good example of what is the law written on their heart, the Ten Commandments are that. They're a good summary of that. So then the last thing, even so, they could still transgress the law because they were left to the liberty of their own will, which was subject to change. So they had a liberty of will. They could choose to obey the law, they could choose to disobey the law. And this liberty was subject to change. What that means is they're allowing for the future act of sin to enter the world. And when sin entered the world, no longer do we have a free will in order to no longer choose one way or the other, to obey or not obey. All we're in now is a disobedience. And it was through the second Adam that this choice of obedience enters back in. And even then, it's still kind of, the flesh still reigns a lot.
I have my mind wrapped around this problem, even though we have this virgin free will that you're talking about. God can still know the beginning and the end of whatever one you do.
Yeah. And as we looked at last week, that wasn't because God foresaw it. It wasn't because God just allowed it. This is God enacting his will through our choices.
I remember Brother Robert saying, man has a free will, all right, but it is only to his nature.
Yes.
And his nature is evil.
It's a good way to do it. I've had several conversations about this because, anyway, I'm glad that you said that because to have the idea in your mind and then turn it into words so you can paint a picture of someone else's mind it's their times where communication breaks.
All right, so we're moving on to Article 3. In addition to the law written in their hearts, they received a command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. As long as they obeyed this command, they were happy in their communion with God and had dominion over the creatures. So, this one I titled God's Commands. So, all mankind, Adam and Eve at the time of creation, had the law written on their hearts. They knew it was wrong to sin. They knew it was wrong to steal. They knew it was wrong to lie. They knew it was wrong to murder. They knew it was wrong. Did I say steal already? They knew it was wrong to steal.
Commit adultery.
Yes. However, in addition to that law, they received another command. That command was, do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This would be another example of positive law. Is it wrong for us to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? No, because that tree doesn't exist anymore. There's no capability there for us to do that. So that rule has changed. So as long as they obeyed this command, they were, 1, happy in their communion with God. 2, they had dominion over the creatures. So after the fall, after Adam and Eve sinned, that communion with God was broken. It was no longer a happy one. It was one of judgment and wrath. And after the fall, the dominion man had over creation was subject to futility. Man would build his mighty empires, would build his grand walls, would build his would tend to his garden, build it and make it good, and then nature would come along. Oh, there's a flood. Oh, there's a fire. Oh, there's a great wind. Your structure got pushed over. Oh, the vine came and eroded the foundation of your house. Now it's toppled. Our dominion the nature of our dominion has changed, just as the nature of our being made in the image of God has changed. So that's, like I said, this was a short chapter. That's pretty much it. I wanted to go over some of these terms. because they do relate to this chapter. So, natural theology. The study of God based on the observation of nature as distinct from supernatural or revealed theology, which is based on special revelation. Because observing nature is an intellectual pursuit, natural theology involves human philosophy and reasoning as a means of knowing God. Is this something that is good or not? Is this something that we should do?
It allows you to know God.
Can we come to a knowledge of God through looking at nature?
Well, Romans 1 does address that
Yes.
thing.
So, yes, we can come to an understanding of God through nature. However, if all we ever do is natural theology and we do not deal with supernatural or God's special revelation, it's also sometimes called special revelation and general revelation. But general revelation, natural theology, all it can do is condemn. Because you cannot come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ through just looking at nature. And with our ability to reason, our ability to rationalize, being corrupted by the fall, it would be hard to have a true understanding of how things are. Creation itself is also corrupted. So it would not be completely unreasonable to think that whatever God created the world does not like us very much, has subjected us to fertility, because, as I said before, all our works get destroyed in the end. He kills us, and then we're gone forever. At least that's how it appears if all we look at is nature. So these are incorrect conclusions that one can arrive from just looking at nature. They're not necessarily unreasonable ones. So you do need special revelation. But again, Romans 1 and several other places, people are condemned based off of what they did with the law written on their hearts and their application of natural theology.
Glad you brought that up. I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Something about people that everybody has that question. What about the Indians? This is the answer.
Yeah, the Indian has the law written on his hearts, and he has access to nature just as the rest of us do. And he took that nature and said, "Oh, I worship my ancestors," or "Oh, I worship the spirit animals," and that brought him condemnation. So, with talking about how natural theology is not the best, and that you can reach inappropriate conclusions, let me ask you this.
No.
Does God approve of, say, homosexuality? Is God capable of writing something that makes it kind of seem like he approves of homosexuality? So, God writes in his special revelation, the Bible, homosexuality is an aberration. In the Old Testament, you're to be stoned for it. Is natural theology, when we look at nature, do we see homosexuality being acceptable at least sometimes? The atheist will try to, well, some atheists will try to say yes. You can, for instance, I know that cows in captivity, bulls in captivity will sometimes start having an interest in other bulls. But does that mean that God wrote down in special revelation that homosexuality is an abomination, deserves to be condemned, destroyed, and those who practice it deserve to die? And yet in God's general revelation, in natural theology, God put down that homosexuality sometimes happens and it's just a thing.
That makes sense.
No. So if we look at nature, so this is just an example. This is true. I believe this is true in every instance of morality. if we look at nature and we arrive at a conclusion that says something that is the opposite of what God says in special revelation, the Bible, we have reached an inappropriate conclusion. God is not schizophrenic. He is not capable of saying this is wrong here and this is okay here. So, the next thing I want to look at, because we've already talked about natural law and positive law. Next thing I want to look at is, do you all know what a dichotomy is? So I didn't write it very clearly, so I'm going to start with the last one, trichotomy. Trichotomy is the belief that humanity is made up of three distinct components: body, spirit, and soul. A dichotomy is just body and soul.
I mean, soul and spirit. I'm sorry.
So I was just trying to write down definitions really fast, so I didn't write down dichotomy very well. So trichotomy believes body, soul, and spirit is what makes us up. Dichotomy says spirit and soul are the same thing, so that's why it's written the way it is. So my definition of dichotomy really makes sense only if you look at trichotomy first. The confession says that we are made up of body and soul, and it would say soul and spirit are the same thing. It doesn't say that, but that's the idea behind it. So there are people in our day who like to say, well, we're made in the image of God. God is a trinity, a three unity. We are a trichotomy, a three division. Because we're made in the image of God, so that's how God is, that's how we are. And the Bible does use the term soul and spirit for different things. But I believe that's something that's really, really recent, and pretty much everybody throughout all time, at least in Christianity, has believed in the dichotomy, body-soul. So that's just something. There's also
Can I ask a question? Because
Sure, yeah.
I can't remember, but I know there was a sect that if you're, you can, how can I say this? Okay, the body is not connected to that, and that, you're sinful, but, how, do you know what
yes, I'm actually about to get to that.
Oh,
So this, I was listening to a preacher who called it Greek dichotomy. I kind of understand it as being something that the Gnostics believed.
yes.
And what they would believe is that they believe in the body-soul distinction. However, they believe everything physical bad, everything spiritual good.
Yes,
And so because of that, that actually leads them to have a weird view of creation, which is the great, good, awesome God created a smaller God who 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 created the world. And that smaller God who created the world was bad. Just that was just a bad guy, because they have this view that physicality is bad, spirituality is good. And because of that, they go into some really weird ascetic stuff. So denial of pleasure and anything that's nice. I say anything that's nice. It's a really bad way of putting it.
what I was talking about is the one that the body is separate from the other, and so they could do anything with their body and it's okay. Do you know what I'm talking about there?
Is that hedonists?
Huh?
Hedonism?
I don't know. I can't remember.
Um,
In other words, the spirit is one
Not
thing
respecting
and
the
the
body.
body is the other thing, and they're separate from each other. And so if you're it's spiritual or whatever, and your body does something, it's okay for the body to do the horrible thing.
yeah, no, I don't.
No,
That
I
seems
know.
kind of familiar, but I couldn't tell you who that is.
Yeah, you have heard of that before.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's been a long time though.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that we would deny.
Yes,
Just
we
as
deny.
just as we would deny that everything physical is good, everything spiritual is bad. The atheist who denies the spiritual side still has a spiritual side, and is still completely corrupted and evil. So not just because there's a spirituality does not make that good and the physical bad. In the case of an atheist, the atheist could be devoted to physically living a good life, and his spiritual side is still dead as a doorknob. So yeah. That's largely it, except that last week I said I gave you what I thought was a definition of predestination and election. I looked it up and realized that was wrong, so that's why predestination and election are included in your term sheet. I think last week I said that election is refers to the saved person specifically after salvation, whereas predestination refers to them anywhere along that timeline. No, predestination is the predestined are those who are going to be at any point, either they have not already or they have already been saved. Election is the idea of God saving you. So in an election, what happens in an election, like our election, like our presidential election, or the election that's coming on Tuesday? I put down my ballot. I say I want this to happen. The next person comes down and says I want this to happen. At the end of it, the grand total is counted. Everybody who says they want this, there's this number. Everybody says they want that. There's this number. Whoever wins, that's the end of the election. The winner wins. The person with the greater number of votes wins. Well, in the doctrine of election, it's that same thing. How many people get to vote? One. God.
That's right.
God voted for you to be saved, and you're saved. Election
Amen.
over.
Praise
That's
Praise the Lord. So
that's the doctrine of election. So
Predestined for you, sure.
yeah. So this was a really short article. I've how much longer do we have? 8 minutes. So yeah. I'm pretty much done. Could I have Derek, could you pray?
Lord, thank you, God, for being so gracious to us to allow us to have this time together to fellowship and learn more about the deeper ways of thinking of your word, this creation that you've made here and us, Lord, in our place in your will, Father. We just ask that you would continue to use this to grow our knowledge of you, Father, through your word, that we would be edified more from you on a daily basis. We pray, Lord.
Man.